Hi, I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. With me, a best-selling author, a new guest. I knew the title immediately when I started trying to book him, and it is Confessions of an Economic Hitman. This is by John Perkins, sold over 1 million copies, and he says that economic hitmen are highly paid professionals who cheat countries out of trillions of dollars. His latest book, called Hoodwinked, and he says why the global economy imploded and how to fix it. And I think we may be headed for another implosion. We'll talk about that. With us again, best-selling author John Perkins from California. John Perkins, thank you for joining us today on USA Watchdog.
Greg, it's great to be with you. My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
And I just want to continue your intro because not only are you a self-proclaimed economic hitman, but you are an economic expert. You were a chief economist at a major international consulting firm in the 70s. You advised for the World Bank, the UN, the IMF, the U.S. Treasury Department, and you did it globally, so you know what you're talking about. Let's get into the big stories that are going around the globe, and unfortunately they have to do with war and Iraq, which is apparently a disaster. And, this ISIL or ISIS, Al-Qaeda offshoot group is taking over a large swath of Iraq. Some people are predicting $250 a barrel oil if this gets out of control. What say you about this situation?
Well, Greg, I think what we have to realize is that we're in a world situation unlike any that anybody's ever known before. We have a global empire. It's a corporate empire. It's not a United States empire. It's the first time in history that it's really not a national empire. It's the corporatocracy. It's the big corporations, the heads of corporations that control everything in the world. Now, this is not a conspiracy theory. These heads of the corporations don't get together secretly and confer with each other. But they are all driven by one motive, which is to maximize profits regardless of the social and environmental costs. And let's face it, the economy of China, the economy of Russia, just like the economy of the United States, is very dependent on these big corporations. China's done a lot to create its own economic growth, but it could not have happened without the big multinationals. So they're playing an incredibly important role today. And in fact, this has created a failed global economic system. Many statistics, but just one that's extremely telling, I think, is that less than 5% of us live in the United States, and we consume almost 30% of the world's resources, while half the world is starving or on the verge of starvation. Now, that's not a model. China can't do that. Russia can't do that. Africa can't do that. Latin America can't do it. 5% consuming 30%. You can't repeat that. But they're trying to repeat it. They're trying to go our route, but they can't.
But is this what the Iraq war, the Iraq burgeoning civil war, a conflict, crisis, whatever you'd like to call it? I mean, how does this impact this? We're using 30% of the global resources and we're 5% of the population. What can go wrong in Iraq?
Well, where I was going with all this is that another force now has stepped up to the stage, and that's the militant Islamic force. And it's a very strong force, and it's a very anti-capitalistic force. So it is the force that's going up against the corporatocracy. And in fact, even though Russia, China, the United States compete on many levels as they're doing in Ukraine and other places, they have a common enemy in a way, which is this Islamic regime that wants to overthrow the corporatocracy. And I'm not talking about all Islamic people by any means. I'm talking about the radical militant Islamist groups like ISIS that's coming into strength in the Middle East right now.
Can we see $250 a barrel oil? I mean, it has no sign of being peaceful. I mean, the president came out last week and said, there can't be a military solution. Then yet he sends 300 military advisors, which is kind of what we did in Vietnam. And what can go wrong? I mean, what should people brace for?
Yeah, I wish I had a crystal ball and could be more clear on that. We don't know what's going to go down in the Middle East, but I think one thing that we can say is that we become aware that the Middle East oil is not as important as it used to be. We've got these tar sands in Canada, which people are fighting. Fracking is a tough thing to deal with. We've got tremendous amounts of oil in Latin America. We've seen a real strong shift in policy recently, moving from the Middle East toward Asia with USAID monies, with a lot of other investment monies, because it's seen that Asia, up until very, very recently, was the next strategic place. Now, happening suddenly in Iraq and Syria, Iran, the whole Middle East thing is exploding once again. I think that Middle East oil is not nearly as important as it was a few years ago. There's other alternatives now. However, having said that, the oil companies will use what's going on in the Middle East to jack up prices as high as they think they can and make as much profit off it and blame what's going on in the Middle East for that. So it's going to be very, very interesting for all of us to watch this. They'll also use that as a way to convince all of us that we should be fracking, drilling for tar sands, building these pipelines that are being so strongly opposed across Canada and across parts of the United States. What's going on in the Middle East will be used as a leverage point to further these projects that are so strongly opposed by a lot of environmentalists.
If you were betting, would you bet on a $150, $200 barrel oil, at least for a while?
I'd give it at least a 60%.
Wow. And then let's move over to Ukraine, wars and rumors of wars. And, the Russians have been reportedly last week of building up on the border. There's lots of fighting going on in eastern Ukraine. The Russians aren't happy with Kiev. Kiev is not happy with Moscow. There's no peace plan. There's no ceasefire. Russia's sending more troops, as I said. They're sending tanks, supposedly, according to NATO, and building up troops on the border. What do you think about the whole conflict in NATO, Ukraine, Russia, the whole area over there that could ignite? And they're also talking about furthering sanctions on Russia. The U.S. is. There are worries about of the U.S. just saying, "Oh, you owe this. So you think we owe you this bond money? Well, we're defaulting." Also, backlash in Europe. I mean, what can go wrong in the whole region over there?
Well, there's a number of things going on here. I think one is that we have to fess up to the fact that we being the United States and the corporatocracy, which basically controls our government, really screwed up. After the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States was the only superpower in the world. But rather than using that as a real launching pad to do great things in the world, we exploited people. And again, it wasn't so much the United States; it was big corporations. But they used the United States, and the United States went along. Let's face it: nobody gets elected president in the United States without huge corporate support. It's not Obama's fault; he wouldn't get elected if he hadn't taken that support. And then he becomes a servant to the corporations, and they've reacted very, very badly, I think, including in the former Soviet Union countries, those states, where the corporatocracy has gone in and the United States, allied with Europe, with much of Europe, has tried desperately to embrace these countries that were once Soviet countries, to bring them into our field of influence, primarily for the corporations. Russia has taken exception to this. And many people in those countries have taken exception to this. Many of those people speak Russian. They relate more to Russia than they do to us. So I think we made some classic errors there. Now, when I say the issue is complicated, it's also complicated because, in a way, the corporations want to see this struggle going on. The threat of war is good for business. It's not just the businesses that make the weapons. They're all gearing up. They're selling a lot of weapons these days. But everybody that supports those businesses, insurance companies, the banks, Wall Street, Coca-Cola, the people who supply food and drinks and so on, everybody out there in that corporatocracy world benefits from the threat of war. We really have what I call a death economy today, which to a large degree is based on war and the threat of war.
That's sobering. Do you think war could break out there? I mean, if you're going to handicap, let's see, war in the Middle East, with Iraq and Iran and Syria and all that, or let's see, war in the Ukraine, the Baltics. I mean, or could they both simultaneously break out?
Well, it's very explosive, obviously, and I don't think the people who are really calling the shots, the corporatocracy, really want war. The threat of war, it serves their purpose very, very strongly. The problem is, of course, people are people. And when you start to have these very volatile situations, somebody can push a button someplace that starts everything going. So I think we're treading on very, very thin ice here. That yes, we could have war. I don't think that's to anybody's interest. I don't think those that really are running things want war. But when you've got such volatile situations, it certainly can happen.
Last week, Janet Yellen spoke, and, I was surprised. I have this theory every time, the Fed head speaks, gold goes down. I don't sell gold. I'm not a seller. I'm just a journalist. But it was funny. It was up 40-something bucks in a day, when she was out talking. And she was talking about the policy and said repeatedly, highly accommodative, did I tell you highly accommodative? And, they're talking about how they're optimistic, but, they're cutting their growth estimates. I mean, we had a disaster in the first quarter. I mean, a plunge from the fourth quarter, 2.6%. They revised, and I'm going to use, I believe, J.P. Morgan's numbers. They revised it down to a negative 1.6%. That's over a 4% plunge in a quarter to quarter. And they're thinking we're going to have positive growth, and I'm thinking maybe what you're saying, they want war, maybe they'll get growth through war. Is that something that might be going on in the background? They never admit to it, I know, but is that something that...
Well, yeah, growth through war or growth through the threat of war. If it's a strong enough threat, the growth happens anyway. We've seen this before historically. But I think it's also important for us to understand, as I said earlier, we have a global economy that's a failure. And it's going to collapse unless we change it. And I think we can change it. We can create what I call a death economy, a change from a death economy to a life economy, and we can get into that later. But I think what's really important for us to understand here is that we have a globally failed economy. As I described it earlier, 5% of the world's population consuming 30% of its resources doesn't work. And that we also know that of that 5%, 1% controls most of those resources. That's a terrible situation. It's like feudal Europe back, in the 1200s. And what we have to understand is that while we have recessions, we have depressions, we come out of them, those sorts of cycles will continue for a while. But in the long run, the trend is toward collapse unless we change the basic economic model that we've developed that we're living by today.
Well, according to the Pope, it may not be in such the long run. The Pope is out again warning about an economic collapse. The Pope has been doing this, that they that an economic collapse is near or close or could happen or whatever you'd want to interpret his. But he's talking about the Pope, economic collapse, global economic collapse. Do you think this could happen faster than anybody would anticipate if there's a mistake, a nuke, a sinking of a ship, a declaration of war, the overrun of Baghdad? Give me your opinion on why do you think the Pope is warning of a global economic collapse?
Well, I think this Pope is certainly one of the most enlightened Pope's probably the most enlightened in my lifetime. He comes from Argentina, a country that defaulted on its debt, that refused to pay it for a while, and has a long history of this type of exploitation. He understands the situation better than any previous popes, and I think he's sending us a very strong warning. Personally, I think we can go into some collapses that then the powers that be will pull us out of these, that they will use the same tools that they used several years ago to pull us out of that collapse. But in the long run, it's a total downhill trend. We are collapsing. Our economy is totally collapsing, and we're going to have to change it. The model that we have, this death economy model, is not working, and we're going to have to change it. And the sooner we do it, the better. There's no question about that.
The Russians have been out, some of the top officials in Russia, multiple officials, and most recently, just last week, there was an economic advisor to Putin who basically is saying that, we should crash the dollar system to inhibit the United States' ability to wage war. And, then we have news from, China and the UK have entered into a trade agreement using yuan and pound sterling, no dollars. And I'm just wondering when the critical mass is going to hit. I pondered this in my weekly news wrap-up. When is the critical mass going to hit? And when it hits, what is going to happen to people who are using the dollar like, American citizens? This is USA Watchdog. Can the dollar collapse suddenly? And what's going to happen to people if and when it does?
We have a long history of making sure the dollar doesn't collapse. That's one of the reasons Saddam Hussein was overthrown and Gaddafi in Libya was overthrown. That's, I think, a big reason why we went after Iran, why we're threatening Iran. Russia's in a very, very interesting situation, and I'll relate to you a story, Greg, that several months ago, there was a Russian TV crew here at my house. They'd flown over from Moscow to interview me for Moscow TV. Two men, it was a large crew, but the producer and the host one of them had a PhD in contemporary religion, and the other was getting a PhD in history. Very, very sharp people. And they both spent time in Syria as correspondents to the Middle East. You know, I asked them what they feel that Syria is all about, and they said, well, in Russia, most people believe that Syria is just, the United States is going after Syria because it's the watchdog for Iran. The real target is Iran, but beyond that, the real target is Russia. The United States wants to go after Russia. And I was kind of dumbfounded. You know, I wrote Confessions of an Economic Hitman. I don't get shocked easily, but this was pretty shocking to me. And then they left, and a couple of weeks later, another film crew was here from Russia. This time the host and the producer were two women, brilliant, also very well educated. And I asked them, I said, what do you think of that idea? And they said, well, of course. Don't you know that Russia and the United States, we have this long history of always believing that the other was going to try to take us over during the Cold War? Then Russia collapsed. So you people in the United States don't worry about Russia anymore. But we in Russia have watched the United States build military bases in over 130 countries. We've watched you go after any country that seems to get in your way, overthrow presidents like the president of Honduras recently, and so on and so forth. We've seen this happen. Any country that has resources, you go after. Russia has a lot of resources.
Oh,
so, yes, we are fearful that you're going after Russia. And Putin's fearful of that. So he's exerting himself. He's saying, I'm not going to let that happen. And I'm going to stop it here in the Ukraine. I'm going to stop it wherever I have to stop it.
Well, it might get to nuclear war if that's the case. And Russia is, the president was saying that they're a regional power, which is absurd. I mean, you see their brand new Su-34 fighter. I mean, it's state of the art. I mean, they have nuclear weapons. They have submarines. They have nukes. They have multiple warhead. Who knows what they have? They have missiles that go, that are supersonic, hypersonic missiles. They have torpedoes that go 200 miles an hour under the water. So, I mean, this could be, if to your point, that if somebody makes a mistake, somebody gets angry, somebody says, you know what, we're going to hit first and we're going to survive. I mean, could this get out of control? Could this get way beyond, the corporatocracy, as you say? I think I'm mispronouncing it, but could this get way beyond the corporate leaders, the corporate controllers, and somebody could just say, I'm in charge, I'm pressing this button?
Well, obviously, mistakes can happen. Crazy person, somebody cracks up on the job. Yes, that can certainly happen. But I don't think it's to anybody's interest to have that happen. Certainly it's not to Putin's best interest. Putin works for the big corporations too. He's very dependent on the oligarchs and the big corporations, and he's constantly struggling with them in his own way in Russia. But we hear about that, but what we don't hear about is his connection to the big multinational corporations, which is very, very strong. He doesn't want that to happen. On the other hand, he and his people do fear the United States tremendously. I don't think we in the United States have any appreciation for how us winning the Cold War, so to speak, in Russia, and the Soviet Union's demise impacted those people. And they've been just as fearful of us during the Cold War as we were of them. I grew up in the 50s when, we were all scared to death that the communists were going to take over. And then in the 60s with the Vietnam War, the red tide was going to take us over. Well, they're still fearful of us. And more than ever. And so Putin's in a position to satisfy his people, probably to satisfy his own. He's a very aggressive guy, he's KGB, martial artist, et cetera, et cetera. So he drew a line in the sand or rather Obama drew a line in the sand at Ukraine, and Putin stepped across it. And really nothing happened. He got his wrist slapped with a few sanctions. But that sent a pretty strong message to him, and he's going to keep pushing. There's no question about it.
And finally, I just want to wrap up about where you put your money. I mean, we had a big spike in gold. So there are a lot of people who like gold and silver, physical coins, physical stuff here. A lot of people are worried that we will have a dollar implosion, that it could come on suddenly. I mean, I had Jim Rickards on, who wrote The Death of Money, and he says, it could happen. It definitely can happen. It will happen. There's going to be a snowflake moment. In other words, we've already created enough snow up on the mountain that, what's going to be the snowflake that drops it all down? He says it's coming. So would you be a holder of gold? Would you be a holder of silver? Would you be in the stock market, out of the stock market, holding bonds? What would you do with your money?
My commitment is to make a better world for my 6-year-old grandson. And that means for every child on the planet. Because today we have to look at a global situation. We realize we're living on a fragile space station with no shuttles. We can't get off. We got to take care of it. So I don't necessarily look at where I think I might make the highest rate of return. I look at because why do I want a higher rate of return? To take care of my family, right?
Correct.
And so what I really look at is how to take care of my family. And I think we're going to have to move from this death economy, which is based on warfare and militarization and on ripping up the earth, ravaging resources, to a life economy, which is about cleaning up pollution, getting companies to clean up pollution, help find ways to help starving people feed themselves better, and new technologies for transportation, energy, communications, all of these things. So I put my money in companies that I feel are taking a leadership role in directing us toward this new form of economics. That includes local businesses that are doing it. It also includes global businesses that are really understanding that we need to create a new economy. And to me, the driving force is how do I make a world that my grandson's going to thank me for? And it doesn't mean that necessarily I want to maximize my rate of return by buying something that's like gold that's non-productive, which may be a great investment, but what's it doing to create a better world? I want to create a better world, and I'm willing to take a risk to do that and put my money in companies and organizations that I feel are striving to make that happen.
John Perkins, best-selling author, Confessions of this is Hoodwinked, I'm sorry, his most recent book, Hoodwinked, and his best-selling book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. You have been listening to John Perkins from California. John Perkins, thank you for adding a fresh perspective to our viewers here at USA Watchdog. I loved it. Very different. I haven't heard that perspective. Very good. Thank you, sir.
All right, my pleasure, Greg. And I just want to tell people, go to my website, johnperkins.org, and sign up for my newsletter because we continue this discussion. And please keep doing what you're doing. You're enlightening the world, and that's so important. The message is so very important. Thanks.
I will link to your website. Thank you, sir. I really appreciate it. Again, John Perkins, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and also Hoodwinked, published author, financial expert. Thank you so much, Mr. Perkins.
My pleasure. Thank you.